Fate of the Furious is now rolling out in cinemas around the world and looks set to be a stonking box office success regardless of what the critics think. That said, reviews so far are mostly positive and fairly consistent with what audiences have come to expect from the series since its radical reinvention with 2011's Fast 5. Is the 8th movie the pinnacle of the series to this point? Absolutely not. But is it a ton of fun and a more than worthy addition to the franchise? Without question. Going by those insane box office projections, you're probably going to see it regardless. But here's what worked and what didn't in Furious 8. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button for more great content. Number 4. It's the weakest of the last 4 movies. It shouldn't be surprising at this point, for as well as the last 3 movies have successfully managed to one-up one another. The 8th movie feels like a slight backstep in terms of quality, perhaps in part because the formula feels so confident and, well, formulaic at this point. Nobody sees these movies for their watertight stories, but the opening act in particular feels a little more awkward and low energy than previous installments. And overall, it lacks the surprising verb of Fast 5 or Furious 7's unexpected emotional impact, albeit a necessity due to Paul Walker's death. All that said, ranking the movies at this point feels pretty pointless, because the last 4 in particular are extremely consistent when it comes to entertainment value. It may signal franchise fatigue coming soon enough, but for now, the films are still a damn fun time. Number 3. Charlize Theron's forgettable villain. First off, Charlize Theron does just about as well as anyone could with her antagonist Cypher, fielding out delicious line readings to help convey the requisite malice. That said, she doesn't feel particularly imposing compared to the series' last few baddies, in part because she spends most of the entire movie away from the action, directing traffic from the comfort of a control room for the majority. We don't see Theron jumping into a car once in the film, which seems like a massive missed opportunity considering how awesome she was in Mad Max Fury Road. Cypher's by no means bad, but just a little on the generic side. Number 2. There are clear tonal issues. The Fate of the Furious sees the series wrestling with the same tonal issues that became problematic in the 4th movie, Fast and Furious, which wanted to be a dark detective thriller as Dom investigated Letty's demise, but also had the silliness of a CGI tanker flipping over the top of a car. The new movie absolutely knows what it is for the most part, but there are times where the silly fun clashes with its more serious elements. An opening sequence where Dom and his team attempts to steal an EMP weapon, for instance, sees them using a wrecking ball to take out a fleet of guards, and the force of the ball almost certainly kills these men. Yet, it's basically shrugged off as no big deal. Compare this to, say, Fast and Furious 6, which had the bad guys using a tank to kill civilians, and the heroes were on the other side trying to stop it. This is just one example, but there are quite a few moments where the draft and the straight up mesh somewhat awkwardly. Number 1. It strains credibility, even for the franchise. Look, the Fast and the Furious franchise is fueled by its own absurdity, but even the series has its limits, especially when it arguably compromises that core theme of family that's ever so important. The real issue here is Jason Statham's Deckard Shaw joining the team to take down Cypher. The film makes surprisingly little effort to hand-wave the fact that he murdered Han, and when it's all said and done, it feels like the gang were far too keen to forgive him for such a horrendous act. Criticizing the script's lack of nuance is a thankless task in a series such as this, but it still felt like this aspect could have used another scene or two, just to emphasize how desperately they needed Shaw to bring Cypher down. And now, here's everything that worked in The Fate of the Furious. Number 7. The Rock and Jason Statham steal the show. Anyone who's seen the trailers won't be shocked to learn that the double act between The Rock and Jason Statham's Hobbs and Deckard Shaw steals the show in almost every scene featuring the pair. Their back and forth banter is hysterical from the get-go, And they're also thrown together in a prison break sequence that's easily the best fight scene in the entire franchise.
It took longer than I expected.
The Rock's charm combines with the Stath's gritty wit to make them a consistently hilarious highlight, and their animosity absolutely needs to be exploited as much as possible in future movies. Number 6. The action sequences are batshit crazy. Surprise, surprise, but yes, number 8 doesn't show the series getting complacent when it comes to the insane action. At this point, it must be a considerable challenge to come up with set pieces to top the vault scene, the endless runway, and the Etihad Tower dive from the last 3 movies. While there's arguably nothing quite as insane as the skyscraper stunt in this film, the final 25-minute set piece in Russia is an absolute wonderful clusterfuck of riotous action. And while much of it has been given away for free in trailers, there's still plenty of inspired madness for audiences to be surprised by. That's to say nothing of the riveting New York sequence and the aforementioned prison break set piece. Even as some aspects of the series are starting to show their age, the action still feels exciting, and yes, surely only a movie or 2 away from heading into space. Number 5. It's surprisingly dark at times. Though there are aforementioned issues with the movie's tone, it is somewhat refreshing to see the series return to more serious-minded territory on occasion. Vin Diesel sure wasn't kidding when he said that the movie would have a 70s revenge movie feel, and away from all of the ridiculous stunts, this film features Dom at easily his most tortured. There are some ugly emotions that come bubbling to the surface throughout, and for the first time in a while,
Dom! Are you gonna turn your back on family?
death actually feels like it means something here, with all of this insanity having some real consequences for the heroes. Yes, it's all brought to a tidy resolution by film's end, but it's at least encouraging to see the series venturing slightly further away from being literal, consequence-free superhero fare and daring to spice the mayhem up with a little grimness. Number 4. F. Gary Gray's slick direction. James Wan did a fantastic job picking up the slack from the franchise director Justin Lin on Furious 7, and thankfully, F. Gary Gray, the Italian Job remake, straight out of Compton, pulls off rock-solid work, helming by far the series' largest film in terms of both scale and scope. Gray's action chops aren't quite as refined as either Lin or Wan's, but he ensures the film style is nevertheless totally consistent with what's come before, and does a totally laudable job keeping the dizzying action never less than coherent. If Gray becomes the franchise's new resident director for a while, there'd be no complaints here.
Dangerous and deadlier side to Dom Toretto.
Number 3. The big reveal is surprisingly not awful. No spoilers here, but most of the movie's pre-release discussion has been regarding Dom's defection to Cypher's side and what precisely could have caused him to turn on his family. There's one very obvious answer to this, but somewhat impressively, the film actually comes up with a slightly more interesting one, which, while still in the same ballpark, is a clever bait and switch that avoids exploitation in favor of something surprisingly believable. Yes, it strains credibility when analyzed in any real depth, but it's actually a lot more effective than what you're probably expecting. Number 2. Scott Eastwood is an entertaining addition. Clint Eastwood's ridiculously handsome son, Scott, joins the fray as Mr. Nobody's apprentice, Eric Reisner, an overzealous law enforcement agent who is quickly nicknamed Little Nobody by the team. Eastwood has had a fairly unremarkable Hollywood career to date, but he slots effortlessly into the team as a straight man who slowly comes to learn when to break the rules. He's charming and plays well off the rest of the gang, so while he's not used massively throughout, he's basically another enjoyable addition to the superhero-sized acting ensemble.
It's neon orange. The International Space Station will see it coming.
Number 1. Paul Walker is barely mentioned. Furious 7 did such a fantastic job giving Paul Walker's Brian O'Connor a poignant send-off that it would have been a huge mistake for the next movie to keep bringing him back up. Thankfully, Brian is barely mentioned at all throughout, save for the team insisting that he's retired and they can't call him up to help with their mission, and a touching nod later on that feels surprisingly organic to the film's story. In short, constantly using Walker's demise as an emotionally exploitative tool would feel tacky and crass, but the taste and class the filmmaker showed in Furious 7 thankfully continues to permeate through.
What's happening, dude? Thanks for the invite.
What did you think of The Fate of the Furious? Shout it out in the comments and don't forget to subscribe.